All right, welcome to a new episode of Cali Claptrap Integral Conversations. Today's guest is Brandon Dayton. Brandon, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks.
Great awesome. So I found Brandon through sort of serendipitous methods. I recently read a book called American Dharma by Ann Glag, who I recently had on, and looked up Daniel Ingram on Twitter, and then Twitter recommended Brandon Dayton, who is a comic book creator of I have here The Green Monk, and I thought, wow, that looked really fascinating. And also on Twitter found him and started looking him up a little bit, and borrowed it from my local library. And Brandon's also a podcast host of How to Be an Artist.
Yeah.
Awesome. So Brandon, I think we have a lot of, I invited you on because I think we have a lot of parallel interests. You seem to be interested in spirituality, sustainable living, urban design, and also art. And so I was just hoping maybe we could start off by a little bit about how you got into art.
Yeah, art has been one of those things that was just always obvious that it was going to be kind of a part of my life from a fairly early age. So, I mean, like the decision to be an artist professionally, I can probably go back to, junior high fairly early on with like Disney animation, and then finding, comics, that's kind of right when Image Comics was coming onto the scene. So I was always kind of going back and forth between like, maybe animation, maybe comics. And then, my professional career has been kind of a repeat of that. I went to school at BYU, Brigham Young University, where I wanted to study animation. They've got a world-class animation program there now. They didn't really when I was going there. And so I ended up studying film and getting really into film. So I had intentions at one point to like make movies. And then when I left school, I kind of just landed in doing kind of illustration jobs and animation jobs. And, still wanting to do animation and in some sense, and eventually I ended up getting into EA Games Salt Lake. And while I was there, that's when I did my first, I finished my first mini comic, Green Monk. So there's a mini comic that preceded the one you checked out, and really enjoyed that experience. And so after doing that, I was like, I want to do comics. And from there was a very years long process of finishing the follow-up. And between that, I ended up also working at Avalanche Software, which was a division of Disney Interactive that time. Had a chance to work on the Disney Infinity project, and then decided to leave just to focus on finishing the comic. And I did that for a few years, and that's kind of where my art career kind of ends, is finishing Green Monk. And since then has been kind of more of a period of evaluation, kind of, reevaluating my life, where I've been, where I'm going. I'm a little past 40, and so kind of midlife type stuff going on. And so,
Awesome. Well, it kind of brings us to current day, and maybe we'll circle back to a couple things. But just sort of right now, you're how is that process going as far as the discovering kind of what's going on? Because I know you have a few. You also have a Medium page, and I was I think you put one out just recently called "The Universe is a Dick," which was a very nice read. But I thought that the last sort of paragraph here was kind of beautiful, and I just kind of wanted to share it with my listeners and stuff. And sanity and wisdom is found in finding peace with the form. Oh, I should read this. Sometimes the universe feels cold and unforgiving, and other times it is magical and generous. Sanity and wisdom is found in finding peace with the former point of view, but happiness can only really be found in cultivating openness to the second. How the universe feels about us can't ever really be known, but how we feel about the universe is entirely up to us.
Yeah.
And I just thought that was a beautiful sort of piece.
Man.
And so I guess, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess that kind of second half of it is discovering the way that the universe can be like generous, and and beautiful has been kind of what I've been discovering over the last few years. So after completing Green Monk, I kind of went into a little bit of a midlife crisis that was really a kind of unpleasant thing. And I had left like the faith of my youth. I grew up LDS Mormon and had left that. And so there was definitely kind of trying to figure out what truth was for me at that point. And that was a years long process. But yeah, I ended up having this kind of midlife crisis. It was really distressing. And part of what I did with it is I started doing, personal therapy. I did therapy with my wife, which was amazing and a great decision. And I've been meditating on and off for probably 15 years, just kind of like, I was introduced to it a long time ago and just, 20, 30 minutes here, maybe 4 or 5 times a week, and but really inconsistent. And I've always kind of had a sense that there was something there as far as a path to kind of figuring out what I wanted. And then in the summer of 2019, I went to my first meditation retreat because I was like, yeah, there's something there. I went to this retreat and trying to abbreviate the story, on kind of the second to last day, spontaneously, without any expecting it whatsoever, I was there meditating and kind of thinking about a teaching we had the day prior about like impermanence. It was something about the teacher had shared this message about, Ajahn Chah, who's a Thai monk, and he has this glass and he says something to the effect of, I love this glass because it's already broken. And this idea that you love life because of its impermanence. And for me, that was like this very difficult idea because I felt like I've been aware of the permanence of life my whole life and it's made me miserable,
Yeah.
just like waiting for death and just that I'm losing these things to the past. And, but anyway, after having that teaching, I was thinking about it that morning, second to last day. And as I was thinking about this teaching, I started imagining myself getting old and sick and dying. I imagine the same with my wife and my kids. This is very, very vivid imagination thing going on. And then suddenly out of the blue, it was like, boom, there's this gigantic rush of joy and gratitude and pleasure that felt like someone had just like injected me with like MDMA or something. And just this explosion of love, this like fire in my chest that was like, oh, this is like this Holy Spirit stuff people talk about, back in my more religious days. And it was just, if I could say one thing about it, it was just the most unexpected and the most novel thing I had ever experienced in my life, where suddenly life was one way before and suddenly life was a completely other way after. So that really, really threw me for a loop because I had not realized up to that point how depressed I was, how much depression had affected my life up to that point. Because suddenly I felt that kind of burned away. I felt kind of released from that. And I'm in this position where I'm like, wow, it's gone. Depression is gone. And then I suddenly realized, oh my gosh, for years, I've just been miserable for years and not been aware of it. So that was kind of my first, realization that like, wow, life can be amazing and wonderful and beautiful. And I guess that's kind of what I get to in that final line. And so that's what I'm still trying to explore. And that's after this experience, in the process of kind of searching for an explanation of what happened to me, that's how I discovered Daniel Ingram, Mastering the Core Teaching of the Buddha, which is his book. And I like that it gave a really good explanation to what happened to me. And it also didn't require me to be part of some dogma. Because I think there is, for a lot of people that have powerful spiritual experiences like that, it can often happen within some sort of religious context where you have some sort of institution that then takes ownership of that and says like, oh, you had that as experience because of this institution. And so I like that MCTB, as they call it, is something that explains that through this idea of the progress of insight, but also allows me to take ownership of the process. And so that's kind of where I'm at right now. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you recently had him on your podcast, and that's one I was able to listen to. And I definitely recommend anyone who's interested more about that experience to go and check that out. And that's with Daniel Ingram on how to be an artist. And And so, yeah, I mean, a lot of this podcast is going to be just sort of shooting the shit and, talking about subjects that I'm not sure many people talk about these days, but I always, part of my goal with this podcast is to talk with other people that are going through similar experiences and connect with them and try to find out perhaps how we can be allies with each other in this process, because, life, like you just shared, going through it, I think with someone else is better. And I think you maybe even referenced that in sort of one of your Medium articles, as far as having a partner with you to sort of help you along the way. And one of the things I was very impressed so far with your writing and your podcast is you're very transparent about not only your professional life but your personal life, and you've shared some things about and I'm not sure if you're okay with well, you are
Yeah,
in the meeting.
it's on the podcast, right?
Yeah, about the use of psychedelics and all of this as well.
Yeah.
And so obviously there's a lot of different stuff to kind of touch on, but I know I share a sort of a similar love and an interesting path of also being interested in art, and very similar of junior high into Disney animation. One of my goals was to kind of write a comic book, and my still most vivid dreams are I find myself in a comic book shop, and that's usually like a magical part of my dream where I go, and it's usually down in a secret kind of spiral staircase underneath a bookstore of just sort of being in, and it goes back to my own memories of going into the comics and stuff. And so, do you have any specific comics and about that you grew up with that really impacted you?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I was pretty fortunate to be uh, exposed to some kind of more unusual stuff, at least for someone in the States. Very early on, I was exposed to a lot of like 2000 AD stuff, like
Okay.
Judge Dredd,
Mm-hmm.
Strontium Dog. Early on stuff like the early Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Akira, the manga
Mm-hmm.
for Akira. So that stuff had a pretty big impact on me. And it's all for completely different reasons. But then kind of getting into junior high, it was more kind of standard stuff. That's when I kind of started discovering like, okay, Marvel comics. And that was when it was like Jim Lee, Eric Larson, Rob Liefeld were all doing their stuff in Marvel, and then made the jump to Image Comics, and then kind of really getting into Image Comics. So those are the ones that I really remember from my youth. And some of those I still go back and read, and they're still like fantastic. I mean, I go back and read like old Judge Dredd, and they're different now. I mean, I can see more of the humor in them because they're basically this British point of view of like the excesses of America. So it's kind of, well, it's actually kind of, it's more than that, because it's this observation of kind of the polarities of America, because you have the Puritanism as like expressed in Judge Dredd, and then the excesses as expressed in Mega City. So that's fun going back and reading that stuff. And that stuff is so wild and all over the place.
Yeah.
But yeah, after that point, it was like years before I really got back into comics.
Right.
It was kind of different stuff that interested me after that point.
And what, if you don't mind sharing a little bit about how you came up with Green Monk?
Oh yeah, that was a weird process. As happens with a lot of this stuff, it can kind of start with a flight of fancy, and then you see something else that you kind of like latch onto that. And so at some point there was a flight of fancy about like having a character that had a sword that was a blade of grass. And I'm not sure exactly when and where that happened. And I remember at some point in college then kind of being like, oh, what if it was kind of like a Star Wars, like it's kind of like a Jedi type thing.
Mm-hmm.
At some point, the thing that really made it click was when I was studying film in school, I was introduced to the films of Andrei Tarkovsky, and particularly Andrei Rublev, which is now like one of my favorite films of all time. And actually just recently went and saw a screening of it. This was recent, but this was probably a couple of years ago. And it was amazing to watch it and be like, oh, wow, 20 years ago, I had an experience with it, and 20 years later, I had a different experience with it, but I still absolutely loved it. But that's where the whole setting of being in Russia at this kind of like specific period of time really came in. I basically just stole the setting of Andrei Rublev for Green Monk. And really, ignited my imagination, that it just felt like a very different setting than I had seen in any other comic. And so I wanted to explore that. And
Yeah.
um, some of
Awesome.
it, I did a little bit of research into Russian stuff, but there's so much stuff there that's just like me making up stuff too. So I
Yeah.
always feel a little bit like I have to put in a disclaimer that it's like, it's kind of like Sergio Leone doing a Western. That's like, you know, sometimes his Westerns are like, okay, the geography is not quite right here, you know, and there's things that don't really match historically, but hopefully it's still fun and interesting to people. You know?
Yeah. Creator's license, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So, you know, it's interesting. You have a podcast about sort of how to be an artist and stuff, and you are an artist. So
Mhm.
what is your ultimate goal with this exploration of the podcast that you have?
Yeah. So the kind of simplest way to put it is that one of the big things that happened after I had this kind of peak experience on retreat was a real investigation of like how I identify. I can remember having this really clear moment after this big explosive experience where I was kind of walking around and just like, I don't have to be an artist. Like the idea of identifying myself with as an artist, I saw that you know, art is supposed to be this thing that kind of liberates you or allows you to step outside of restraints. But it's really easy for you to create restraints for yourself with that label as well. And there was so much stuff that I was telling myself as far as like, I'm doing this with art, which, and it means I have to keep doing this. And I really like narrowed my focus and my possibilities in a certain way by how I was making art. And so with how to be an artist, like first and foremost, I'm giving myself license to like follow all my interests and not to try to like create these barriers between them.
Yeah.
And so I have a particular interest in like urbanism. I have a particular in contemplative arts. I'm interested in like community. And so I'm really interested in saying like, okay, I'm just going to talk about all these things and I'm going to see like the ways they intersect, and the ways that they intersect are like super interesting to me.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I don't know, finding the niche, the audience that is interested in those same intersections is kind of a little bit of a clumsy process right now. Like I can tell I have audience from my YouTube channel that's very interested in like, how do I get better as an artist, you
Mm.
know? And I have some content that's talking about meditation, and I can tell there's a specific audience that comes to listen to that stuff. But I would like to find some sort of like intersection between those things, and hopefully have that generate some interesting stuff.
Yeah. One of the things that, you know, I've always found interesting about art is I always like to think about, or I forgot if there's a direct quote that I'm thinking of, but looking at your life as your own piece of art, and how can you create it along the way. And so I was interested if you had a magic pen then where you could create sort of in the next 20 years or so, what do you think your vision, where do you think, what would you create?
Yeah, that's a great question. And this is exactly what I've been trying to work through myself. Um, and as I think about it, what I'm really interested in, what I've always really been interested in, is creating something new, or something that opens up people's the sense of opportunities for people of what's possible. So I can remember having, and I like doing it with other people. So those two things I want to do more of, and I can talk more about specifics. But I can remember having a band in high school and like forming a band, and you form a band, and then you're just kind of looking around at each other and we're like, wow, we did it. We have a band. I didn't think this was possible. This is so cool, even though we like totally suck. But you know, we had
Yeah.
so much fun doing that. And then I can remember like my senior film project. We had this really ambitious project where it was like, I've got pyrotechnics, I had like animals and just like all, you know, horses and things like that. And it was a period piece. And I can remember with being with the crew as we were like finishing up filming this thing, and just having this awesome sense of like, wow, like we did it. Look at this cool thing that we accomplished, that we did together. Um, and so that's the sense I'm trying to recapture. And so what I'm really interested in is kind of applying that um, to particularly like community and place. Like those are areas I'm really interested is creating spaces where art and artists can thrive, that are kind of like unique spaces. Um, and so that kind of means there's an intersection with that, with like development and understanding like development. So that's something I've spent some time learning about, but also just finding ways to organize community that gives you kind of this like bubble that buffers you from the norms of the outside world. Since we kind of live in this materialistic capitalist society, which has its benefits. Like, I'm not some like anti-capitalist, but there is a tension between that and being an artist. And so to some sense, I think it makes sense to create kind of a reality bubble that you can go into as an artist where the norms are different, and where you can, the things that make good art can be more normalized. Yeah, hopefully can make it a little bit easier to make art, or at least as far as art is difficult, you're making it difficult in the right ways, not in ways that are just annoying, I guess.
Yeah. And so there's a lot of, I think, for you particularly, you've dabbled in film, you've dabbled in animation and drawing and video game. So are you imagining sort of like, I'm sort of imagining like a loft of artists that are able to sort of have this flourishing sort of building where the great art comes from? And if that is the case, sort of where, and obviously you're dabbling all around and stuff, but for you particularly, is it making a new movie? Is it making a new comic book? Is it making this sort of, giant utopian kind of community, or is it a mix of all of that?
Yeah, I kind of feel like the thing I'm most interested in right now is this kind of idea of creating a space first. And one of the other episodes of How to Be an Artist, I talked to my friends, Jackie and Dallin Serva. Sorry, Jackie and Dallin Serva. Hopefully I didn't mess that up the first time. But they basically created like an art co-working space for filmmakers that I participated in for a few years. And so I think that's like a really good starting point. That's something I'd be interested in trying to put together within the next few years. But I really love the model of like monasteries as like a model for how you can create a space for artists. Like, there's a lot of things about monasteries that I think are very, very interesting. Like, first off, there's this whole idea of renunciation with monasteries, where it's like, we're going to live on very little. And there's this kind of spiritual quality to it, where it's like, okay, you're going to find the people that are really committed, because they're going to be willing to pay that cost to do it, right? But there's also this idea of sustainability. It's like when your overhead is like some robes and some bowls and places to sit, like that's an easy thing to keep going. So I'm kind of interested in like how you can apply that. That's kind of my larger pie in the sky vision, is how do you apply that to can you create a space like that you can plug artists into that can be generative of like good art? So.
And have you participated in any of the monasteries that are sort of out there as far as taking it in? And
not yet. I want to start being able to do that as much as I can. I mean, I'm married and I have kids, so that limits a little bit of what I can do. But I mean, I've already like talked with my wife about it, and like there are opportunities I want to look at to be able to spend a little bit of time in some of these spaces and get a little sense of how they operate and ideas there,
Yeah. And you've also kind of taken retreats as well, where you've sort of experienced maybe some level of that, not necessarily on the artistic side, but definitely the spiritual vibe.
Yeah. So I've done like 2 retreats really. One was a 5-day and one was like a weekend retreat. So my experience is limited there.
Yeah.
But I'd like to have more experience with that. So
yeah. And so that kind of co-op that you were participated in, that you mentioned with the friends, the films, was that a physical space or was that a virtual sort of collection?
It was a physical space.
Okay.
I mean, of course, this is like pre-COVID, right?
Right. Yeah. So do you feel like you have a group of friends, colleagues that identify and your spiritual interests as well as your artistic, or is that because I find, in my own life, like, they always say you don't discuss religion and politics at parties, and that's usually my 2 podcasts that I do, because, to me, those are where a lot of really interesting things happen. But to find people that are actually immersed into it as much as, you sound like you are, you tend, I think, to live kind of a lone wolf sort of life. And so I was wondering, have you found artists that also share an interest in sort of your vision?
Yeah, well, first off, I think you're right that there's like a huge overlap between those two things. I mean, art and religion are just like the boundaries are really, really blurry, especially look at historically how art emerged, and it's tied to the hip to religion. And so spirituality and art, I think, are very, very like connected. And it's interesting. I do find some of those connections in some of my conversations I've already had on the podcast. I mean, I have a category of discussions on my podcast where it's just me talking to art friends, and then I have another category where it's like, oh, here's this particular person that's doing something interesting that I don't know, but I want to ask them about what they're doing. And those are kind of two different types of episodes if you listen. But it's interesting when I'm having these discussions just with art friends, how some of those things start to emerge as you just start talking about, like, why are we making art in the first place? Just as you start asking these questions that just, if you kind of push at those assumptions and kind of like investigate those assumptions that we don't really question, a lot of those things start to emerge, like these kind of spiritual existential things like inevitably emerge when it's like, why did you choose to spend your life doing this thing? So it's happening in little pieces here and there, but I do think that I think I'm at the early stages of trying to collect some of that a little bit. So I think I really was impressed by my discussion with Lincoln Cannon, who I mentioned from the Mormon Transhumanist Association. He kind of talks about like his process of organizing the MTA, and how it was this very incremental process. It was like, here's the thing we want to do. Let's get a few friends together that are interested in it. And I've watched it now over 10 years because I happened to be there at the inception of it. And I've watched it over 10 years as they've kind of expressed this very particular vision of an intersection between Mormonism and transhumanism. I've seen it really grow into this really thriving organization. So that's kind of my idea is I want to just start like putting these ideas out there and saying, hey, here's what I'm thinking about. Here's what I'm interested in. And just finding other people that it resonates with and just like continuing the conversation,
Yeah. And to jump off on that a little bit, I do have to ask you what's your take on South Park and the Book of Mormon and is it Trey Parker and Matt Stone, the creators of that, I believe? I forgot if I'm mixing up their names, I apologize. But do you have a take on sort of their direction of art and Team America and all that, where they went?
I mean, I love their stuff. So, I mean, I think Team America has some of the funniest scenes. There's a fight scene at the beginning of that's one of the most hilarious things ever. And I kind of have like mixed opinions about their depictions of Mormonism. So I left the LDS Church, which is the largest Mormon denomination. And it's what most people think about when they think about Mormonism. And that was about, that's coming up on 10 years ago that I did that. But I still consider myself Mormon, just in the sense that both my parents are basically Mormon, going all the way back to when there were people pushing hand carts into the Salt Lake Valley. So it feels very much almost like this pseudo ethnic thing to me, where it's identity feels very tied to it. And there's still very much about it that I relate to. And so when it comes to something like the Book of Mormon the Book of Mormon musical, right? I went and saw that with my wife, and there's part of me that's like, oh, there's something that really appeals to me about this, because they're representing my experience, which as a Mormon, you rarely get to see that, right? But then there's lots of things that just bothered me about, like, they're not quite getting it right. They're not quite getting what it feels like to actually be a Mormon, right?
Yeah.
And it's not that I don't mind being really crude or vulgar, or even being like really, really hard on Mormonism, but I want you to criticize it for what it actually is, and not for that. There's kind of this caricature. They portray this caricature of what they think Mormonism is that I just kind of missed the mark for me.
Yeah.
And there was also a sense of so I was here in a theater in Salt Lake City watching the Book of Mormon musical, and clearly I'm in this theater full of people that are not Mormon, laughing at this thing about Mormons. And there's kind of this feeling of like, we're outsiders laughing at someone else, that felt kind of like wrong to me in a sense. So the fact that it's not something that an actual Orthodox Mormon would go to and could watch and could appreciate on some level, that kind of bothers me. So
Why did you leave?
oh, that's a long story.
In a short nutshell version, perhaps.
Yeah, the abridged version is that so there's many reasons why you're going to be part of a religion. They're kind of like maybe legs to a stool, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like one of them could be like, oh, this is kind of what I have to do. This is like, if I don't do this, I'm not going to be saved, you know. And then there's a stool that's like, sorry, a leg that's like, I'm doing this because it feels right for me and it makes me happy, you know. And then there's like, I'm doing this because I feel like I would be whatever, I would be ostracized from my family and my community if I didn't do this. And so for me, it was just a factor of each of these legs kind of getting pulled out one by one, where I kind of realized, okay, I don't think my salvation is dependent on this, you know, but I still feel like it's good for me. And then it was like, okay, I don't feel like this is really making me happy anymore. And then I'm growing spiritually here. And then, you know, feeling like, oh, I can actually step away from this and I'm not going to be ostracized from my community. And it was kind of, as each of those things kind of eventually was pulled away, I felt like it was the right thing for me to do. But when it comes down to it, it was really an intuitive feeling. It was a feeling of like, this is not right for me, like spiritually anymore.
Yeah.
And I made that choice with a total understanding, and it's still something I feel that like, it's very much like living in a home and saying like, this is my home, but there's problems with it. There's a leaky roof. There's an analogy one of my guests used, Danny Jones, which happened to be one that I had used with my daughter. And it's like, at some point you have to make a decision. This house with all of its problems, is it worth staying in, or do I need to leave this house? And so I decided to leave the house. But ever since then, I've kind of felt to a certain extent like I don't have a home. I prefer to have a home, but I want one that I'm not afraid is going to collapse in on me or family, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. Yeah. To kind of jump from that topic, to go back to sort of, you know, with the use of psychedelics, it's, you know, it feels like in the small amount of work that I've kind of gotten from you and stuff, it's when what I appreciate is that it still feels like you're kind of searching for something and continuing this process of sort of kind of self-growth. And I was wondering, is that sort of your use of psychedelics, has that been beneficial for you, do you think, in the long run?
Yeah, you know, there was a time when I think I wanted the same thing from psychedelics that I ended up getting from meditation. Like, there was a time when where I wanted to be saved by psychedelics. And I've had a few experiences with psychedelics, but none of them have been very deep experiences. As far as I ever took extremely large doses, the largest dose I took was probably maybe 2.5 grams. And much of the rest of what I did was microdosing, where I was just taking a small amount, you know, and people say like, oh, microdosing is supposed to do all this stuff for your productivity. And it was just like, it just gave me a high. It just, it just felt like any other drug, you know? So I was, you know, in this period before I went on my first retreat where I had my peak experience, I was kind of thinking, oh, I want to do a big psychedelic dose. I want to do an epic dose of psychedelics, and I want to do meditation retreat with the hope that they would save me in some way, that they would kind of, I would find some sort of path forward. And it's been interesting since my experiences with meditation. I've really lost all my interest with psychedelics for now. And that's not to say that I won't at some point maybe revisit that, but part of it is that I had a really bad experience with having a mind that was in the midst of meditative growth and psychedelics at the same time. And so I'm kind of like, I want to stabilize mentally with what I'm doing with meditation first before I try that. But I'm also just seeing the power of the mind, like, on its own. You know, I've described, so ever since this peak experience, it's been about a year and a half, and I've sometimes describe it, and I've had a very dedicated practice since then, about an hour a day of meditation. And I've described it as like the slow motion acid trip. I can just see my mind changing at these very, very fundamental levels. And that becomes really, really fun, where it's kind of like, wow, this is just my mind. I don't need an app. I don't need some sort of like to ingest something. Just with the right direction, the right practices, I can make my mind do things that are like really amazing. And in a lot of ways, like very, very healing. So,
Yeah. One of my questions, kind of to go back to sort of a little bit about what we were talking about with your vision of sort of this, artist commune area that I'm calling, not that you called it, but
that's
so
great.
if you imagine yourself at sort of your workstation and this is already created, do you still think you're called to put together a film, put together a book, or do you feel like that's still something that you're on track to do or called to do?
Yeah, my instinct is that I'm going to return to comics. I mean, some ways, the way I kind of think about it lately is like, I have this like instinct to kind of build a nest. And once I build my nest, then I can like go start laying eggs and be a bird nest. But I'm really curious about what it'll feel like to create those spaces, and then to just start making art in those spaces and see what emerges. But I'm pretty sure I'll get back to doing comics again at some time. I just have enough ideas and things that are interesting to me. And I know what it feels like. I mean, I spent all this time, the time I spent making Green Monk was a really cool experience as far as discovering what it felt like to spend all day, every day working on comics. And I like how that feels. There's a real piece to doing that. And I'm familiar with it, and I know I can do it well. So, it makes sense if it's possible to go back to doing that at some point.
Are there any comic book creators titles right now that do you think reflect or are invested in some of the same sort of intersections of spirituality and art?
That is a very good question. I might have to think about that a little bit.
Let me throw a name out there and see if are you familiar with Grant Morrison and like the Invisibles? Have you read
yes, I have done Invisibles, and I've read a lot of Alan Moore. So there's there's absolutely that going on there. So
yeah. I'm also drawn to the idea, I kind of like this. Have you heard of Jeffrey Kripal?
No, I haven't.
There's a book called Mutants and Mystics, and he's a religious scholar, and he talks a little bit about, kind of going back and looking at sort of the history of maybe kind of esoterics, psychospiritual kind of stuff. But, it brings up sort of this idea of the superhuman and perhaps the powers that are wait at the end of sort of this, sort of even, sometimes there's, you do rumors of myths of, you do enough spiritual practice and perhaps, you await your own spiritual power sort of at the end of the rainbow. You should
definitely look up what Daniel Ingram has had to say about that. He has a lot of very interesting stuff to say about
yeah, definitely.
About the powers and magic and stuff.
Yeah, it's interesting stuff. And I also, just think about, I think the impacts, looking at some of the Marvel movies on how that has an influence on our culture, obviously Star Wars stuff. But yeah, I think there's a very good pool of just, unlimited potential there if you can tap into it.
Yeah. As I think about it, I think what I am noticing more is I'm noticing I kind of see it everywhere now. I don't know if there's particular books that stand out to me, but it's like, I can look at Star Wars or something like Harry Potter that's so mainstream and just be like, man, there's these very obvious spiritual things going on, archetypal things going on there. One thing I just finished with my kids was Steven Universe. I don't know if you've seen this.
What was it?
Steven Universe.
Oh no, I'm not familiar with that.
An animated series. And there was so much in there that I was just like, oh wow, this has so much to do with stuff I'm thinking about as far as like meditation, personal development. I mean, it's really interesting because you have these godlike beings but how they need a human in the form of Steven, who's kind of the main character. They need this human in their lives to really become human themselves, which is it ties into
Yeah.
the idea of the 6 realms in Buddhism that talks about
Mm-hmm.
in these God realms, and they call it the jealous God realms. But to progress, you have to be in the human realm.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
it's kind of like you start seeing stuff everywhere. And I think that's the interesting thing about art is kind of a way to get to that part of your mind, and it gets expressed. I remember the first time I did psychedelics, after that, just kind of being like, oh, this is what artists do. They get to that place in their mind, but just by another route. So I think
Yeah.
a lot of this stuff just comes out on subconsciously, unconsciously. And so I read a lot of different things now, or watch things where I'm just like, oh my gosh, this is all about, like, I just watched with my kids. I watched Three Amigos the other day. And suddenly I had all these spiritual levels to me, all these existential levels to me.
Wait a second. You were watching Three Amigos. This is the one with Stephen Martin, Martin Short, and Chevy
Yeah.
Chase, and you were having a spiritual experience.
Yes.
Watching Three Amigos. What was the spiritual experience you had watching Three Amigos?
Well, it's interesting because there's first of all, there's like these 2 layers of, there's this fiction they create, right? There's this fantasy of the 3 amigos. And then they obviously by error are drawn to this town where they end up actually kind of like creating this, they make the fantasy a reality by enacting it.
Yeah.
So this spiritual idea of, by enacting an archetype, you kind of make that archetype, you embody the archetype, which gets to, there's like specific meditations, like Tibetan meditations.
Yeah.
You like visualize a deity.
Right.
You're really good at visualizing it, and then you replace their body parts with your body parts until you embody the deity.
Mm-hmm.
I thought there was this really interesting, and there's a kind of a sense of, as you're watching it, a sense of destiny that, like, okay, and it was already set up by the fact that they were portraying the 3 amigos as actors, and it kind of calls them to this destiny of actually like embodying the 3 amigos.
Yeah. What was the villain in that?
El Guapo.
El Guapo. I love the line where, I haven't seen this in years, but someone asked, do you know what foreplay is? She goes, no. And she goes, oh, don't worry, El Guapo.
Neither does El Guapo. It was a movie that I watched. I must have watched hundreds of times as a kid.
Oh, yeah.
But I haven't seen it in years. But then I'm watching it with my kids, and it's like every single moment in that, I'm like, oh yeah, this.
I remember seeing that in the theater with my mom. I believe it was, that was awesome. So I guess my final question for you, and to kind of put you on the spot before leaving. So you kind of am ambiguous about whether or not you think the universe is listening to you, for you, or if it's just sort of indifferent and impartial. Yeah. And just to put you on the spot, what is your take? Do you think the universe is, working for us? Do we, or do you think it's sort of indifferent?
Oh man, I think it's like a great mystery right now. I tried to, one of the comments I made in there is that I think the only appropriate thing to approach it with is just an intense amount of humility. But with that, I think becomes like an amazing amount of awe as well. And to me, it's a really open question. I talk a little bit about this. It's a really open question about where I begin where the universe ends and where I begin. What I know for certain is that, like, there's definitely more than suffering involved. Mm-hmm. Suffering is definitely a part. There's a lot of that going on, but there's definitely like an amazing amount of like generosity and love and creativity and abundance. And I mean, I'm very excited with just the project of getting to understand existence a little bit more. Just like, what does it mean to be, here and alive, but not in some sort of abstract way, but in a very, direct way. So yeah, I don't know.
Beautiful. Yeah, that's perfect. Well, I can't wait to see, again, the work you put out, and I can't wait to continue to follow your journey and see what you discover.
Awesome. Yeah. Thank you.
Brandon, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
It's been a pleasure.
Awesome. Thank you.